So to start off, I would like to address Ms. Alsalem the very first question. Madam, there is a big presumption or a myth that rape is a crime of lust or passion or sexual desires gone out of control. So I would really like to ask you that with your experience on such an international level, what do you see are the different motivations for and types of rape and victims of rape? So what do you see around the world?
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank the Asma Jahangir Foundation and all the organizers for this invitation. If anything, the only regret that I have is that I couldn't be with you today in person. I actually have been to Pakistan a number of times, and I have always been very touched by the hospitality and warmth of its people. Now, turning to the question, yes, as you say, this is one of the biggest myths. And we know that rape is not about sexual gratification or desire. It's about power, control over a person without their consent. We also know that mostly it does not occur on the spur of the moment, unlike what many might think, but it is actually premeditated and planned. And judging by the staggering numbers of persons that are subjected to rape, of which the majority are, of course, women and girls, reducing it to passion or uncontrolled desire is just really wrong. Also because the implications are quite astounding of what it means to be male if we were to go with this proposition. So I leave you to consider that. Now, rape is a human rights violation. It's a manifestation of gender-based violence, and also under international human rights law, it can amount to torture. And in fact, it's a violation of a number of rights, whether it's the right to autonomy, whether it's sexual autonomy, right to privacy, right to be free from violence and discrimination, and the right to the highest standard of physical and mental health. These are just to name a few. And as you know, under international humanitarian law and criminal law, rape can also constitute a war crime, a crime against humanity, and can constitute a constitutive act with respect to genocide when other elements of the crime are present. Now, what is the key legal divide between rape and non-rape is the issue of consent or the lack of consent, which is what the definition of rape is based on in many states, and also the use of coercive circumstances. So the latter can be the threat or actual use of violence. And the other issue is, of course, that while rape has been historically criminalized as a gender-specific crime that consists of vaginal penetration of women, this has now changed. So it is recognized by most states that rape can occur to any person, and it can happen against any person because of their gender. So it is not limited to persons that were biologically assigned the female sex at birth. And persons of diverse gender orientations and sexual orientations can also be exposed to gender-based violence and also can be victims of rape. And I think we should not forget that. So therefore, legislation today in many states is gender neutral and covers all persons. And today also criminalization of rape explicitly includes all type of penetration, however slight, of a sexual nature with any bodily part or object. I also would like to stress that many states criminalize marital rape, although there are also other number of states that do not criminalize it, which is of course problematic. And finally, there's the contentious issue of the age of sexual consent. So usually what states do is they set a minimum age of sexual consent through the criminalization of rape of children under a specific age. Where consent, therefore, is not relevant since they are not deemed capable of giving this consent. And what happens, therefore, is that these criminal laws criminalize this type of rape as statutory rape by establishing, for example, that any sexual act with an individual below the age of 16 constitutes statutory rape, with the exception where there's, for example, a maximum of 3 years of age of difference. And according to the information I have, the majority of states set the age of sexual consent at 15 or 16 or 18. And therefore, in cases involving child victims, some states do eliminate the statutes of limitation also that apply to adults. Yes, I'll leave it here.
As UN Rapporteur, what would be your advice or recommendations to Pakistan in effective implementation on the laws on rape?
So we have to recognize that any law, no matter how good it is, it's affected by the surrounding context of different forms of discrimination and gender-based violence against women, as myths and stereotyping by the media and the justice system, which Mr. Walid Iqbal and other speakers have alluded to. And in fact, in that sense, the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women had stated in its views that it expressed in 2010 on the landmark rape case Vertido versus the Philippines, that myths and stereotypes had affected in that particular case the victim's right to a fair trial, and that the trial judge had focused on the personality and the behavior of the victim, and also had insisted on the lack of evidence of physical resistance. So what we know is that even when there are good laws, rape is frequently not reported. And when it is reported, it is seldomly not prosecuted. And when it is prosecuted, it seldomly leads to convictions. So there are structural, normative, and policy factors that need to accompany the implementation of a law so that the impunity of perpetrators can really be challenged. So there we heard, of course, about capacity building, education, both formal and informal, that needs to take place. And I echo that, because what we need is really a whole of society approach. I also wanted to re-emphasize the issue of lack of consent, that it made central to the criminalization of rape, since it influences something else we didn't really talk about, which is the standard of proof. And when the definition of rape is based on this lack of consent, the burden with respect to proof is shared with the perpetrator, or at least shifts in part to the perpetrator, which is fairer from one that requires a standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, criminal provisions on rape should also specify the circumstances under which the determination of lack of consent is not required, or where consent is actually not possible. So, for example, when an accuser is temporarily or permanently incapacitated because of drugs or alcohol. We should also pay attention to the issue of re-victimization, which has been mentioned, and that can happen also when the victim is forced to enter into contact with the perpetrator, or is forced to testify in the presence of the perpetrator. It can also occur, as we heard, when we have victim blaming biases. And in that respect, I should mention that it's good that some states have passed legislation that tries to prevent that. So, for example, preventing the use of a victim's sexual history to undermine the credibility of their claim. We talked about the consent issue, that legislation should establish the consent of children below the age of 15 or 16 is immaterial. And also it should have an extraterritorial application, as otherwise prosecution may be precluded in cases of rape committed by citizens in other states, including those serving in peacekeeping missions abroad, which of course is the case also for Pakistan. It does participate in peacekeeping missions. And last but not least, I would say that the crime of rape should be prosecuted ex officio. In other words, it should not be wholly dependent upon the victim's complaint, and the discretionary powers of prosecutors should not be too wide. Now, all this, and since Valerie spoke of good practice, is highlighted in the model legislation of rape that the mandate of the Special Rapporteur has produced in 2021, and it is also publicly available. Thank you very much.